Dr. Greg Sadler is a very interesting philosopher. The first time I met him, he was working on faith and reason, Christian philosophy and Hildebrand, Anselm, and anger. And he's continued to work on anger, faith and reason, and Anselm. Very insightful. We'll discuss almost anything. He's kind of like the street evangelist of philosophers. He does talks at local libraries, does talks at churches. Basically, he'll go talk anywhere, and he'll talk about anything. So it's a lot of fun. He started a company with his wife called Reason.io. If you want to click and maybe help him out, 600 videos he's done on there. He has 2 million views and 20,000 subscribers. So that's a pretty big impact. So he's spreading the philosophical message. He even does philosophical counseling. So if you need some counseling, and he's even worked with some transgender issues, I think. So and he also does tutorial sessions in philosophy. So the philosopher himself, Dr. Gregory Sadler, I present to you.
Thanks. So Ron doesn't mention that we met at one of these Steubenville conferences years ago, and we clicked almost immediately. Back then he was brother Ron Hurl, and we've always had a great time talking. It's not entirely true that I'll go anywhere and talk to anybody, but it has to be within some realm of competence, because otherwise I'll beg out of it. But I'm willing to go out on a limb quite often. So that may be what's going on here. This is going to be a bit different than many of the other talks, because I'm dealing with something fairly specific, the emotion of anger, and then some of its implications for leadership and organizations. So there's not so much big picture stuff here in the sense of metaphysics or the history of philosophy or things like that. But I think it's very useful. And I think that Thomas Aquinas provides us one of the best models for understanding anger. What I'm going to do here in this talk is there's 7 parts, but I may not do all 7 parts. The first 3 are more or less theoretical, just developing the model. And I actually have some handouts to delude you with. You don't necessarily have to look at them now. They're sort of for reference. There's a lot of information in there. But I want to go through Aristotle's theory of anger very briefly, talk about Thomas's treatment of anger as a passion, as an emotion, and then look at Thomas's discussions of anger and its relations with rationality and morality. And then, I want to do some application, since this is a leadership conference. I think that this is useful stuff for talking about contemporary organizations, whether they're religious or non-religious. So I wanted to talk about some common situations in which anger becomes an issue, and some of the remedies that Thomas proposes. I wanted to focus on this category of the difficult good and what that might mean in today's organizations. Talk a little bit about anger and its possible uses and many abuses as a motivational tool, and then finish by talking about leadership and leaders and anger. So let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle, in the ancient world, is one of the first theorists to seriously examine anger. It's not to say that he's, the first person to talk about it. Plato, of course, has this, discussion of thumos in the Republic, and there's a few other interesting discussions elsewhere. Plato talks about common causes for people getting angry with each other in the Gorgias and in the Euthyphro. But Aristotle is the person who really brings it all together. He never produces a work on anger, the way some of the later ancients will do. So we have to kind of piece together what he's saying to us from a number of different texts. And Rhetoric Book 2 is very important for this. The Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics are important. The politics is important. And there's a host of other references here and there that are important as well. He also has several different dimensions of analysis of anger. When Aristotle, this is in the Topics, he says, When you talk about anger, you can examine it from the perspective of the natural scientist, the physikos, or from the perspective of the dialektikos, the person who's approaching it in a more psychological way. In my work on Aristotle and anger, I actually differentiate 6 different modes of examination in his works. But here I just want to talk about 2 of them primarily. One is, the psychological dimension. How does anger work? How does it arise? And then he also has this sort of what we can call ethical or proeretic dimension to anger as well. And that's very important, and Thomas will take these up. So in Rhetoric Book 2, Aristotle provides us with a very coherent definition of anger. And it's got a number of different moving parts, a number of different components. Anger is unlike some of the other emotions in that it's very complex. It's already got feelings of pain and desire mixed in with it. It's got affective components. It's got what we might call cognitive components built into it, the sense that there's been some sort of injustice committed. A very important term in there, by the way, that he uses is phenomene, which we could translate as apparent. That's how it's usually translated. But we can also translate it as imaginary. People will often imagine things that get them angry. And it's not just the cause of anger that's phenomene. It's also what anger wants, which is timoresis, translated sometimes as revenge, retaliation, retribution, punishment. It's going to correspond to Thomas's use of vindictum and a whole bunch of other vindict, dash cognates in his works. Aristotle says that's phenomene too, that the person who's angry wants to see the other or imagine the other person being hurt in response, being made to suffer in response. Now, the main cause of anger for Aristotle is what he calls slighting, oligoria. And it takes 3 main forms, and Thomas will take these up. We translate these usually as contempt, kataphronesis, spite, epiderasmos, and then however you want to translate hubris, wanton outrage, insolence. And Aristotle doesn't do quite as much work on parsing these out as Thomas does, but he does talk quite a bit about how kataphronesis works. When we get away from the ethic or the rhetoric, and we start looking at the ethics, and we also start looking at certain passages in the politics, what we see is that Aristotle views anger not only as a psychological phenomenon that's going to happen in life, and he wants to know how it's going to happen. He also wants to analyze when anger is appropriate, when anger is the right thing, when it's the wrong thing, what makes it the right thing. And within his theory of virtues and vices, there is a virtue that is associated with anger, praotes, which interestingly enough, in like the Greek New Testament, praos is the meek, right? We translate it in Aristotle scholarship as the mild or the good-tempered or something like that. When you're reading the Gospels, you think meek means never get angry at all or something like that. It's worth keeping in mind, though, that if you look at the Septuagint and you look at the description of Moses as being this mild guy, it's the same term. And we know he lost his temper quite a few times, getting in trouble sometimes for that. But being right in getting angry quite a few times as well. So, what sort of virtuous disposition would this be? Aristotle gives us a number of sort of qualifiers for this. Getting angry at the right time, for the right reason, with the right person. We can turn these around and think about, the right person. Great example. How many of us have been angry at one person and then in our state of anger we're irritable and easily get angry at another person or have the same thing happen to us? That would be a sign of not necessarily a vicious disposition, but certainly something apart from virtue. The virtuous person, it's not that they're never going to go astray, but most of the time they're going to get angry when they should. They're going to get angry to the degree that they should. They're going to forgive when they ought to forgive. Aristotle says that the mild person is more disposed towards overlooking these sorts of things, to not interpreting them in terms of personal attacks or slights or things like that. Now, he also does discuss anywhere from 3 to 5 vicious dispositions with respect to excess. Thomas takes him as discussing three. I think that a case can be made, and this could be an interesting sub-discussion, for there being additional ones in the Nicomachean and Eudemian ethics discussions, but three is probably enough already. He also says there's one in deficiency. If you don't get angry when you ought to get angry, and you do that typically, you're a vicious person. And if you don't get angry on some occasions where you ought to get angry, you may not be vicious, but you're doing actions that are along the lines of vice. You're certainly not virtuous by never getting angry. So you can see a big contrast between this and not only a lot of Christian ethics, but also a lot of other ancient ethics. The Stoics, for example, said never get angry. It's always a bad idea. If you read, for example, Seneca's On Anger, nothing good ever comes out of anger. Cicero, who's usually willing to side with Aristotle on a lot of things against the Stoics, takes the Stoic side and says anger is the worst. So there's that. The Epicureans see themselves as being in between the Aristotelians, who are way too, bound for glorifying anger, and those Stoics who are too puritanical. Christian, thinkers come on the scene, and some of them have a zero tolerance attitude towards anger, like John Cassian. Cassian says that you should only get angry at yourself for your vices. That's the only time you should ever get angry. And there's quite a few people like that, and they're working off of scriptures that talk about anger. There's a whole interesting discussion that we could go into there. The whoever gets angry with his brother. Some versions actually inserted a without cause. And there's a lot of discussion about that. Cassian says, doesn't matter. Forget that gloss. Augustine actually says, well, yeah, I think without cause that makes sense. Still not a great idea. Aristotle is providing us with a robust conception of anger, in which anger can be the right response, but we also have to be on guard a lot of the time against it. It's also directly connected with our conceptions of justice and injustice. So it's a distinctively human emotion. Thumos is felt by animals, and animals can act in a way that's like anger, like orge, but anger proper is really a human thing for Aristotle. It's also one of the most rational of the passions. So that's something that Thomas will take up as well. So, you think about this. One of the key things to take from this, it's our very nature as beings that are concerned with justice and injustice and who are rational that makes us more vulnerable to being overtaken by anger. So now when we turn to Thomas, Thomas is, of course, going to build from Aristotle's account. When it comes to the discussions of the emotions, he's doing some really interesting innovations that I think are quite valuable. But in many respects, he's following Aristotle. All the stuff that I've got here is taken from the Summa, because if you go to, like the commentary on the ethics, you're not going to find anything in there that isn't in the Summa later on, as far as anger goes. Other things, yes. But now, one of the key differences is that Thomas interprets Aristotle as having, a thumatic or irascible appetite or orexis, however you want to translate it. Aristotle doesn't actually say that, but you could read that back in. And you could say, well, look, Aristotle does divide orexis into, desire for pleasure, for avoidance of pain, and then this thumos thing, and then, boulesis, whatever that is, and that's hard to translate. Thomas takes that as being will. All that aside, Thomas is sort of, he's however you want to view it, whether he's sort of imaginatively reconstructing what Aristotle should have said, or reading something that actually is there in Aristotle. He says that there's an irascible appetite. And I think that's a really important contribution. There's a part of us that is concerned with things beyond just what the sensitive or concupiscible appetite wants or is concerned with. There's something that's distinctive to that. Animals have that, but not quite in the same way that we do. So he's rethinking this. And the irascible part is concerned with the good and the bad, or the evil in a more complex manner than the concupiscible is. It's the good or evil considered in terms of some difficulty, difficultas, or strain, elevatione, fight, pugnam, or arduousness. He says ratione ardui. Pursuing or avoiding, involves running into these. It's when things get sticky. That's when the irascible appetite gets engaged. It is shared in by other animals. They have an anger response, which seems to be more focused on avoiding evil. In Prima Pars 81.2, he says, by the irascible appetite, the animal does two important things, or actually three. It resists attacks that hinder what's suitable to it. It resists what inflicts harm upon it. And those are two different things. It also involves overcoming and rising above obstacles. And when he's thinking about why animals actually have this, why they have a second appetite, it's because they have a special inclination of nature to removing what is harmful, to changing their environment, to changing their interactions with things, so that the good can actually be realized. Anger is actually the most complex of the emotions, Thomas says. It's not only the one emotion that doesn't have an opposite, which is an interesting thing in itself, but it's also the most complex. He says that it is a general emotion, in that it's an effect produced by the concurrence of several causes, so that it embodies, or we can think of it as consolidating these causes. Anger, he says, already contains contrariety within itself because it has hope and sadness mixed together. It also has pain and pleasure mixed together. And we can look at a number of different aspects of Thomas's treatment of anger. If we look at the emotions that are involved, besides just anger itself, what it's composed of, anger involves sadness as a response to some kind of injury or some kind of threat. It also involves desire or hope. And what does that hope for? For revenge, or I'm going to just call it vindication, because it's closer in cognate to the term that he uses, vindicatio or vindicata. There's a whole bunch of different cognates that he uses. And the idea is that it's setting things right. That's what anger really wants. And it desires that, it hopes for it. Anger is also concerned with good and evil in very complex ways. It views the injury or threat as an evil, and it's an evil because it's going to damage some sort of good. So there's this interplay there. It views the other person as, in some respect, evil because they're threatening or damaging, generally by interpreting what they do as malice. It also views the vindication opposed on the other person as an evil that's imposed on them, but an evil that's imposed on them as a good, as the good of justice. So there's this very complex interplay within the workings of anger. The aspect of difficulty is also important to attend to. He says, difficulty is presented by what threatens or what injures. There's a difficulty in preserving good or in avoiding evil. We become angry when things are at stake, when we feel that they're threatened. There's also a difficulty involved in what it is that anger wants, which is that vindication, because generally people don't just let us impose some sort of vindication on them. That requires some work as well. So anger is the emotion that primes us to do these things that in many respects need to be done. That sounds pretty good, right? At that point, so we should be angry all the time, just protect ourselves, and getting a little bit more specific, he takes up Aristotle's slighting, which he just sort of transliterates as parvipensio. And he distinguishes three modes. So he talks about contempt. Aristotle called it cataphronesis. Thomas calls it despectus, sometimes contemptus. And that's treating a person in ways that undervalue or devalue them. Literally looking down upon them, right? And Thomas, Aristotle, when he's writing about this in the Rhetoric, he says some things that look like they might not fit into his discussion of slighting. Thomas has a way of addressing these and saying, no, look, it always does end up being some sort of slighting, treating people in ways that they shouldn't be treated. So Aristotle will say, well, when people interfere with other people, that makes them angry. Thomas reads that into what spite is. Spite is interfering with or impeding a person implementing their will. So he gives us a gloss on something Aristotle doesn't explain to us very well. Insolence is when you treat somebody else bad so that you can get some good feelings from it. Think about bullying, for example, right? That's a prime case of insolence. I bully you so I can feel like I'm the big guy, and it makes you feel terrible, and I delight in your terrible feeling. All of these get people mad. And all of these not only get people mad for themselves, they also get mad when they see it happening to other people. And Thomas, interestingly enough, will say that it's not just those who we are friends with or those who we identify with, or even subject matters that we're concerned with, like, say, philosophy. If somebody makes fun of philosophy, you got a bad temper, you get mad at them for making fun of philosophy. He says that we can get angry on behalf of another person insofar as they are another person, insofar as they are a member of the human race. So there's a wider scope for it. When we turn to thinking about reason and morality, anger is concerned with justice, and that's the sort of nexus for those two. He says that injury is injustice, and imposing vindication is justice. Anger desires evil to the person not as evil per se, but insofar as it has some aspect of the good. Or at least this is the way it's supposed to work. They assess what they're doing as just and as vindication. So when I get angry at you because you cut me off, and then I go and I cut you off, even though I'm doing something stupid because it could cause an accident, right? I think that I am setting things right. I think that this is a good thing. This is part of why we go so easily wrong with it. Now, what determines whether anger is going to be right or wrong? I mean, tons of Thomas here. What determines whether any emotion is right or wrong? What's the one thing that we can say about all of that?
Prudence.
Well, prudence. And what does prudence do for us, in part? Right. Yeah. If prudence allows us to prudence is a whole bunch of things, but prudence in this case is allowing us to see what reason is telling us, what we ought to do. So not every case of us getting angry is going to be subject to reason. Much of it is irrational. Now, the irascible orexis, or appetite, it can be a subject of virtue, he says, insofar as it's moved by reason. And when that happens quite a bit, then it can have a perfecting habit. That's what the habit of gentleness or mildness or good temper actually is going to amount to for Thomas. So I want to talk a little bit about three modes that this takes, one of which is not actually virtuous, but two of which are. Vindication by its own impetus, you might say, tends to produce a focus in the person who's angry on, what they're doing is being right, being just. Tends to produce its own sense of being rational or being reasonable. Now, reason, I don't know what I was trying to say there. Reason can actually guide us and help us determine whether the vindication that we're trying to seek is really just or not. But reason has to be working in that case. Virtuous anger for Thomas is going to be like what it is for Aristotle, getting angry at the right time, for the right reason, to the right extent, letting it go at the right time, not transferring it to all sorts of other people. If we can consolidate that into a habit, we have what we need. We have a good virtuous habit with respect to it. He also talks about zealous vindication. He uses the word zealous to denote anger that's properly directed and structured, or as he says, in accordance with the order of reason. And interestingly, this can even be motivated by the virtue of charity. He says that when one seeks vindication not for one's own sake, but because of the neighbor or even God, for offenses against God or one's neighbor, because one views those as one's own through charity. There's when we're talking about zealous anger, that's the way Thomas makes sense of it. Now, the irascible orexis can obey both reason and the will. One way to do this is to apply, as he says, certain universal considerations. This can allow anger or fear to be modified. Difficult to do once you're actually angry, of course, right? We've all had people try to reason with us or try to reason with ourselves when we're angry, and it doesn't work quite that well. But if we keep doing it, we get better at that. He says also we become angry at sometimes because reason reveals to us that we've been injured. It's not just our senses that reveal that to us. Sometimes reason says, you shouldn't put up with that. This is a place where you should take a stand. So like with Aristotle, we've got somebody who is saying anger is quite often a good thing and the right thing for us to do. Now, there's many other cases where we're not supposed to get angry, right? So I'm going to go into those a bit now. He says, anger can interfere with or cloud over or even seduce reason into its service. And this occurs, he says, in part because anger syllogizes. He's taking this from Aristotle. He doesn't mean syllogizing in the sense of like the formal syllogism, with three propositions and all that sort of. What he means is it puts together lines of reasoning. Anger is a rational, or at least semi-rational emotion. So anger can not only involve reasoning, it can also impede it. He says when reason is leading, anger is really a good thing. When anger is leading, then reason ends up getting sort of corralled in to its service, and then we get into all sorts of trouble. Now he says we can talk about three vicious dispositions as sort of types, as ways of going characteristically wrong. Again, here's a place where Aquinas is very closely following Aristotle, but making some great contributions of his own. He talks about wrath, ill will, and rancor. Wrath is the people who get angry quickly and more angry than they ought to. These are the hotheads. Aristotle says these people aren't that bad because they also tend to quit being angry fairly quickly, right? This is where Aristotle then will distinguish between the hotheads who do that and then the people who are just irascible. That's a different vice. Thomas lumps them in. So these are people who get more angry than they should with the wrong people, that sort of thing. Then there's even worse than that, though. There's the bitter. The people who hold on to anger, who brood, who even conceal their anger. There's a really interesting remark, too, by the way, in Prima Secunda 42:5, where he says that we really ought to, he's talking about fear. He's saying we should fear the meek and the cunning. Why? Because they tend to conceal their anger. We should fear them more than regular people. Because he's talking about this sort of tendency. What do we call this passive aggressiveness sometimes, or the people who just wait till they can stick it to you, but they're angry. And then with the rancor, these are the people that are difficult. They won't rest until they exact some sort of punishment. Aristotle calls them the chalapos. I like to translate that sometimes as the pains in the asses. The people who are just irritating all the time. They always gotta be right. They gotta have things their way. That's a vice. That's a characteristic condition of a human being, right? Now, anger is one of the capital vices as well. Thomas inherits this discussion of the 8 capital vices, which then become the 7 deadly sins, and he endorses it, takes it on. Anger is one of them. How does anger, lead to that? It tends to produce other vices and sins, and you can see some discussions of that on the handout. He says something really interesting at one point. He says, when we act from a vicious habit, there's malice rather than just ignorance or passion involved. Why? Because a kind of connaturality is generated. The person comes to see acting that way as suitable for them, as involving goods for them. So the greedy person tends to see the world in a greedy way, right? The angry person tends to start, that old thing of the person who's got a hammer, sees every problem as a nail. The angry person starts to see everything in terms of justice and who's being wrong and how I should get revenge or vindication. That tends to become their mindset. A lot of angry people actually generate the very conditions in which they get angry, and we've seen this happen quite often. Now, what can help us with that? There's 2 virtues that that Thomas talks about in particular, the irascible appetite as such really falls under fortitude, because fortitude is supposed to structure that. It keeps us from withdrawing from reason's dictates under the influence of those irascible emotions. But the one that he talks about in terms of the virtue of mildness is temperance. Mildness restrains the desire for vindication. It tempers it in a certain way, if we want to be very punny. So that's not everything that you could say about Thomas's theory of anger, but that's already quite a bit of time consumed. Let's talk now about some present day stuff. If we think about slighting, can we identify these three types of slighting in interpersonal relations and in organizations? Do people treat each other in contemptuous ways? Do people impede each other's will? Do people sometimes inflict pain or suffering on other people just because they get a kick out of it? I think we can say yes. Those are going to lead to people becoming angry. And anger within organizations is something that can cause an awful lot of friction. There's also a tendency for anger in one person to spill over into other people. If I get angry, at Ron because Ron says something mean to me, and I've got a bad disposition with respect to anger. And now you're my customer, and I treat you badly, and now you're ticked off at me, and now you're going to talk to my manager. Pretty soon we're all angry. We want to be attentive to how these things happen. There's also personality conflicts, miscommunications. Aristotle had the example, and Thomas has this example somewhere, about a person not being as interested in a topic as the person who's really fascinated with it is. People get angry over that sort of thing. We want other people to see things as important as we do. If you're the customer and you want me to care about your order, and I don't care about your order, you're probably going to feel that I'm slighting you, and so you're going to get angry. Another thing that's very important in organizations, I think, is the sacrifice of working towards justice to other values, sacrificing justice for other concerns. And the three things that I thought, and this might be something where a lot of people would have even better ideas, the bottom line. There's a constant tendency to sacrifice the legitimate interests of employees, of managers, of customers, all sorts of stakeholders to some sort of bottom line. And if that happens, people are going to legitimately get angry. You should expect that to happen. Another thing would be keeping up appearances. Academic institutions, I think, are particularly susceptible to this, but companies that are very worried about their brands sometimes too. Or the good of the company in a rather vague way. That can generate quite a bit of anger. Failure to address issues that typically cause or prolong anger within organizations. When people don't feel like they're being listened to. When they're being treated as merely being irrational for being angry. Right? So if you get angry, you lose. Right? Usually when you're dealing with HR. Okay, I'll blaze through as much as I can then. I think that's a bad paradigm to work with. I think that in a lot of organizations, I'm going to give you this big broad thing. A lot of organizations, everything dealing with anger has been outsourced to HR. That's not where we want to have it, in part because, this is something that's going to be happening everywhere, and leadership needs to be involved in it. Leadership needs to be modeling, good attitudes towards anger and helping people work through things, but also in part because the HR people aren't themselves equipped to deal with it. They've got these psychological models in place, or communication techniques or things like that. You can buy all sorts of packages for these, and most of them stress, when anger's happened, something bad has gone on, right? And maybe you should talk it out. But they don't actually try to get at when anger is legitimate and how you might deal with the fact that people do have to impose vindication upon each other. We ought to be asking ourselves questions like, well, to what degree should we let people say, hey, I don't like what you're doing there. You're a jerk. That can be vindication in some cases. That can get you in trouble with HR, saying stuff like that in some places. So I think that Thomas, this is the last thing I'll say, I think that Thomas offers us a lot of resources for understanding anger in a very robust, nuanced way that would let, if we can get this into organizations, can let us handle the problems that are arising and that are going to keep on arising so long as we remain human beings. So that's that. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Go back to meekness.
Okay.
Dante, on the fourth cornice of purgatory, bears meekness as the corresponding virtue to wrath.
Yeah.
But you're saying that St. Thomas does not.
So wrath understood as one of the 7 deadly sins, right? Anger by itself as a passion is not yet anger as a capital vice or a deadly sin. You have to have a vicious disposition for that. And so the virtuous disposition of mildness or meekness or however you want to parse it out, there's a lot of translations for that. That would be what's opposed to that. That would be what keeps that from happening. But for Thomas, like I pointed out, that does sort of like get sucked into, I'm blanking on the term, not prudence, the virtue, temperance, sorry. For Thomas, there's this very complex interrelation of these. But, within the scheme of the 7 deadly sins, there's often, opposed virtues to it. So, does that answer the question sufficiently, or? Yeah.
I'd like to ask about, I know that you've done a lot of philosophy classes in prisons.
Oh, yeah.
And I wondered...
Not lately, though.
Not lately, yeah. But I wondered if I know you're working on anger back then, in Fayetteville, and I wondered if you taught on anger in the prisons, and if you did that, what kind of reactions did they get? Would they find it interesting? Or?
Yeah, they found it very interesting. I did teach about anger, using it as an example in ethics classes when we talk about Aristotle. But then I also did, at Indiana State Prison, the prisoners organized their own continuing education program. There's a whole conversation that could be had about that. There was a culture of education at Indiana State Prison that no longer exists there, that was incredibly transformative in changing these guys. And it was not just working upon them as subjects; they were using what was being brought to them to change themselves through their own discussions. And so they organized a summer continuing education thing because there was nothing going on in the summer. So one summer I did a class on the virtues, and we looked at Aristotle on anger, and I used some similar handouts, and some of the guys found it extremely useful because there's so many of these things where, and this might be something that I think some of the audience would be better at articulating than I am. There's something about understanding the way the emotions work that gives us a power over them that isn't a new agey kind of thing, or a self-help kind of thing. There's an intelligibility there that allows us to then figure out where we are and how screwed up we are and start unscrewing ourselves up. And this is important in spiritual formation. That's why the monks were so interested in anger in the desert. That's how we got the anger being.
One of the things that's fascinating about this is Aristotle and St. Thomas are working with Plato's notion of higher and lower emotions.
Yeah.
And the subordination of them to reason. Mm-hmm. And St. Thomas inserts the notion of will.
Yeah.
In there for justice. So you get basically the cardinal moral virtue in relationship to these emotions, which gives you the universal principles for moral activity.
Yeah, I'd say that's Okay.
So if you get rid of the faculty psychology,
you're kind of out to sea.
The universalization of moral norms basically collapse.
Yeah, even if you have the wrong faculty of psychology,
Right.
that's where the Stoics went wrong.
Yes.
Because for the Stoics, all you have is the proiresis, the faculty of choice, which is the rational faculty, and then you have the emotions, but they're really just modes of thought, and they're totally irrational. So the wrong kind of faculty psychology is not going to do you any good either.
Because it's the hope and the fear that puts you in touch with reality.
Yeah. Anger and hope and fear and even despair, these are all irascible emotions, are ways of our making sense of the good that we desire, the evil that we want to avoid, and the situation that we're in.
Right.
So they connect us with reality. But they can also give us...
If you have prudence, they can.
Yeah. I mean, they can also lead us into thinking reality is very different than it is, like the coward who is afraid of everything.
Have you worked on the connection in particular? Some of the examples you made match not really meekness, but other virtues related to it, which are clemency and vengeance. And kindness. Have you worked on these connections?
Well, vengeance is vindictum, and that's what anger desires. And I talked about that in terms of zeal and I've looked at that stuff. I didn't talk about the mercy part here in part because I just didn't have the time. But in the paper, see, I'm supposed to be writing a paper for this, and the paper just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, like they do. So it'll be in there, yeah.
Because very often in the moral experience, they are so related to one another. Because in a sense, meekness makes me just moderate my anger, make the patient.
Mm-hmm.
But then I need to decide what to do. In a sense, I need to understand if there is a reason which is more related to justice to do something compared to the evildoer. So even in a company, I need to understand if I got angry, I'm moderating it, but what do I do next?
Yeah.
So, and that's not for meekness, that's for justice. And then I need also to understand how much I need to punish somebody, and that would be clemency.
Yeah.
And which, interesting enough, requires equity, because it's the problem with clemency. Somehow clemency seems to go against justice, right?
Yeah.
Because if there is a right way to punish the evildoer, I need to do that, right? So clemency means that there might be a reason to bend the rule, because maybe in that particular situation it's not the case to be that strict. So in a sense, that goes back to equity or to equitable judgment in prudence. So it's very interesting dynamic of a bunch of virtues working together most of the time in the same context.
And notice too that when you impose punishment on a person, they're generally going to think that you're doing wrong in punishing them, because otherwise they wouldn't be doing what they were doing in the first place. And so then they're going to get angry at you. So if you're a boss and you're trying to moderate your own anger and figure out how much you ought to punish in this case because the punishment's actually deserved, you also have to think about how that person's anger is going to affect things, even if their anger is totally irrational.
Are you familiar with the Kitty Genovese effect? Have you heard of this?
No.
New Yorkers, I'm sure, know Kitty Genovese. In 1964 in Key Gardens, Queens, she was murdered by a man, Winston Mosley. He stabbed her in this atrium, and he'd go back to his car to see if she was dead yet, and he came back 7 times.
And nobody else came.
And there were 60 people in the apartment complex looking at this, and one person came down to help. So this so disturbed the sociologists and the social scientists that they run studies called the Kitty Genovese effect to see what happens, what is the phenomenon here. And they discovered, James Q. Wilson in his book, The Moral Sense, he summarizes this social scientific research, and they found out, this is the consensus, that people who are sympathetic won't help people in distress like this, but people who score high on anger will. So those people up in the apartment complex were temperamental and angry, somebody would come down and help. But because they're probably law-abiding, good, decent, sympathetic citizens, they don't help.
Yeah.
One of these experiences like they'll have a woman, an older lady, she's just an actress that she appears to be getting mugged by some hoodlums, and One person might go and help, the rest of them sit on the bus and watch. And they'll do studies and they find out, well, those are sympathetic people. And the angry guy went to help. And soldiers in the battle, the guy who gets the Congressional Medal of Honor and saves his buddies, he's the angry guy in the platoon. The nice guy is...
Yeah. I mean, I can attest to that from personal experience, that when you have anger problems, because I got interested in this because I had pretty serious anger problems, and I can't say I'm virtuous with respect to anger yet. You look for opportunities in ways to intervene, you know? You're more prone to that. There we were talking also about the connection between anger as an emotion and then the thumos, more broadly speaking. You know, I mean, this is why Plato, you were talking about that, saw that as a necessary component to actually get things done. Reason by itself, it's great because it tells us what to do, but the appetites won't actually be governed without, you know, something coming down on it. Yeah.
Well, I find that anger is really a measurement, usually, of my spiritual stability on any given day. Especially the biggest problem, outbursts.
Yeah.
For example, I can go out to a 5-day retreat. I think I've gone to the mountaintop of spiritual insight. And I get in my car, I'm on 435, and somebody cuts me off in traffic.
Yeah.
Boom. Right away I want to speed the car up and give some kind of daily justice to it and stuff like that.
Daily justice.
That sudden outburst of anger.
Yeah.
Is really the thing that breaks it. You can sit here and give a great calm lecture on anger in a lecture room, and you go home tonight and your wife says you didn't take out the garbage, and everything was saying about ethics and what.
Yeah.
And Adler said, there's really, that's what Adler said, there's really only 2 types of emotions. Adler said the rest may be feelings, maybe desires, and that's fear and anger, because they erupt.
Because they drive, yeah.
They go through the whole body. This whole thing in emotional intelligence, that's why I say it's a bunch of nonsense. It's all really the taming of the irascible emotion, and we will spend the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
How learned we get, or how much reflection we get.
Let me just say one thing, and then I'll answer your question. We not only get angry at other people, you know, towards whom we can have relations of justice. Thomas considers this when he's talking about, you know, anger and its relation to justice. We get angry at inanimate things that aren't persons. This is a sign of how screwed up we are, you know. I remember being a kid and getting angry at the wind for blowing in my face, you know. And you know who else talks about that? John Cassian. He says that these monks go out to the desert because they, you know, like the retreat, they think they're going to get away from it all. You bring your anger with you, and if you're not angry at your friends back there, you're going to get angry at your book, at your pen, at your sleeping mat. He's talking about this in the Institutes, you know, and it's so irrational, you know.
But it's fascinating because
yeah.
It's a sign that we interpret the world in a providential way. So somehow,
so we're angry at God.
Justice and injustice in what happens to us. So in a sense, when I get angry that way, I feel like I need to apologize to God after that, if I'm a believer.
That's very interesting.
If I'm not a believer, it might be an open door to a design for something that happens. So in a sense, I get angry at somebody, in a sense.
Yeah.
If I truly get angry, otherwise I'm just crazy. But sometimes I get angry because I expect something from the order of things in the cosmos.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen the right way. So
this is the 6th way of anger.
Very good, excellent talk. In your experience of all the people you've helped, what have you noticed about modern culture? The people you've helped. What have you noticed as the biggest challenges?
Well, the first thing is people are without resources, you know, or the resources that are readily offered to them don't turn out to actually be resources at all. I think that with respect to anger, a lot of the anger management stuff that's available will actually, it'll wean people away from really bad vices, but it'll make them vicious in other ways. You know, like for example, I'm actually not. I'm not in opposition to cognitive behavior therapy or stuff like that. I think some of that is quite good, but you see them very often saying you shouldn't focus on whether anger is right or wrong. Just, you know, it's always a bad thing to get angry. Not all of them, but much of the literature out there. And so, okay, so if you take that position, and that may be what's offered to you, right, and there's nobody else on the scene, then you end up developing a different vice, and you either become passive-aggressive, or you're not angry when you should be. So what this sort of stuff can do is offer us more sophisticated models that do more justice to our human nature, which is complex, you know, and then allow us. When I was talking too about the prisoners, you know, when a prisoner engages in moral reformation, what happens is they're working upon themselves. There has to be a choice made to sort of take agency and say, this part of me is really screwed up, I'm going to work on this, and I don't want this to be me forever. It can't just be something imposed from the outside. But people can only do that if you actually have resources to offer them, you know. And so that's what I think, that's what's really great about ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy. Yeah?
One other thing that is a trigger, what have you learned about, especially with prisoners maybe, but other groups where you sense elevated psychopathy at work? And what's the difference in the anger you might observe with that person versus?
So anger, this is what I would say, is more something felt by humans who are normal. You know, Thomas talks about the difference between anger and hatred, which is, you know, Aristotle does this too, and so does Augustine. Aristotle says anger is felt for specific reasons. The angry person wants the other person to suffer in return. The person who hates wants the other person literally not to exist. And you can be driven by different passions other than just anger. When Aristotle talks about people who are, whether we translate it as bestial or brutal, like there's nothing you can do with them anymore. I think that's what psychopathy or sociopathy really amounts to. It's part of why we can't do anything with them. Yeah.
You mentioned about anger being directed toward inanimate objects, but strictly speaking, you can only have the angry at a person.
Strictly speaking, but we can get angry. He says we can get angry.
Then you have to explain to the inanimate object why it is that what you're doing is justified. Basically, have to talk to it.
Then you'd be even crazier.
That's right.
We said earlier today, though, that you never reach for an object, you reach for a relationship.
Yeah.
So, in that sense, getting angry at
you never choose.
You'd be getting angry in the relationship.
Yeah. You're getting angry at the relationship that this has caused.
Yeah. You know, another thing I was going to say too, because I forgot about that when Fulvio was bringing it up. Aristotle points this out, and then Thomas picks this up. We get angrier with those who we think wrong us out of malice. You know, in Aristotle it's out of injustice. In Thomas it's out of malice, as opposed to those who are doing it out of passion or are doing it out of some sort of mistake or error or mischance. And part of like getting yourself on track with anger is learning how not to see what other people are doing to you, because they're going to do stuff to you. People are going to bump into you, and the person who's got a vicious disposition with respect to anger, they see everything as an instance of malice. And the same thing could be said about like inanimate objects. If I'm seeing my book as malicious because it fell with the pages open, there's something, I'm really badly off. If I can just see that as a mischance, you know, atoukema in Aristotle's Greek, then I can say, it's not that big of a deal. I may still feel like irritated, but the irritation will go away, you know.
What are you doing? I've often met people at pastoral level who are angry at God.
Yeah.
And, by the way, you shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
Rather than sitting there and allowing them to vent the anger, that is really the essence. That's how I think any form of pastoral counsel, not to judge their anger too quickly. I mean, especially with people in prison or rehab, they're not only angry at God, they're angry at God and the whole world that He brought into existence. And that's a big part of the relationship with Him. That anger will be there sometimes for years and for that.
Yeah.
People get angry at they're in their 50s and their husband died before them. So, and they grieve for years, but it's grieving, but it's also an awful lot of anger that the loved one is taken away from them.
Yeah. Sometimes when you talk things through, you find out like there's layers. Like I'm angry at this, and then I realize I'm really angry at this, and then 3 years later I was really angry at this. You know? Yeah.
I've heard a lot that anger kind of operates as a secondary emotion, where there's always something underneath it. I'm wondering how that would kind of play into the Aquinas or...
Well, Thomas says something like that. You know, all the irascible emotions are secondary in that sense. They're all trying to realize the difficult good in one way or another, and we only feel them in part because we have other emotions already in play. With anger, it's really clear because anger has sadness involved, it has desire involved, hope, sometimes even joy, like when you become addicted to the thought of revenge and you're just dwelling on it and stuff like that. People get really joyful or happy, or however you want to translate it. You know.
There's also revenge.
Yeah, and inflicting revenge is, you know, one of the great quotes that Aristotle used came from the Iliad. Anger, sweeter than honey dripping from the comb. Sweeter than honey dripping from the comb.
Right, well, St. Thomas says that the pain of anger terminates in the joy of revenge.
Yeah.
From an Italian.
What about can you speak to the biochemical or the personality element in all of this? Because some people seem more prone to anger, as you pointed out.
Yeah. So Thomas, like Aristotle, recognizes that there is a somatic, component to this. Let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle says, for example, that once a person becomes angry, their body is in motion. He thought of it like blood boiling around the heart, which Thomas used too, but we don't need to be wedded to that to say once a person gets angry, there's these changes going on in their body that make it easier for that anger to continue. So Aristotle recognizes that, Thomas recognizes that can make it more difficult to deal with it. Some people are temperamentally, Thomas thinks, more prone to irritability. Again, we have much better medicine and scientific explanations of that than he did. Like now we know that if I drink 20 cups of this every day, I'm probably not going to be good company. Although Thomas could have figured that out too. But so there is a physical level. They all avoid reducing the ethical and the psychological just to the physical, which is what I think a lot of people today don't do. I think a lot of people want us to say, well, neuroscience is going to give us all the answers about this. And you look at a lot of the experiments that are carried out in the name of neuroscience, and the groups that are worked on are very small. The conclusions that are drawn are very large. They're always done in circumstances that are rather artificial. I don't put much faith in that approach myself. But, yeah.
Just to add to that, there's a neuroscientist that Bill and I have read, and he's read it more than I have. He's talked to read Walter Freeman's work, where he deals with nonlinear dynamics and the neurons, so not the rest of the body, but just the part of the brain.
Yeah.
And just nonlinear dynamics, like when you're intending towards something already, it's like feeding the anger. That you're actually pushing your neurons to keep on going. So there is a physiological aspect to it. And if you do feed that anger, like you let yourself be mad, you're affecting your neurons in a way that they're going to start the waves are going to start washing over, and it will be harder to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that does work from anger management is this technique of like just going and taking a walk, right? But it only works if you don't remind yourself that you're taking a walk because you're angry. Because if you think about the anger at all, exactly what you're talking about happens. Yeah, exactly.
I think your work would be very useful to mothers and daughters.
It could be. I know for me as a father, it's been useful.
Can you explain this to a child that, you know, you're experiencing this right now?
Oh.
Words for it?
Yeah.
You know that girl that was mean to you at the park and that you can't eat dinner tonight because you can't wait to get back there? Like,
yeah.
I think if this kind of language was available to parents, because, you know, as a parent, sometimes all I can say is like, shut up, eat your dinner, close your mouth, and go to bed. But if there were words like this to deal with so that you could explain to the child, because that helps a lot, just to know that it's a thing.
You know, another thing with that too, and I'm saying this from some personal experience, is for many kids, the models that they're being given deprive them of hope of change. And so, you know, if you understand anger and why you're angry, and you actually have something that says, look, it could get better, then you're not going to despair, which can generate more anger as well. Yeah, but a lot of kids, you know, will say things like, I hope I don't get angry because I don't know what I'm going to do afterwards. And once I get angry, I can't do anything about it. And they're saying that because people are telling them those things. Yeah.
The thing I found most effective in calming anger down in the outbursts are short prayers. Like let God, the serenity prayer. I mean, I used to have a prescription pad when people would come in and they were angry and they were miserable. I said, I'm going to write you a prescription, and if you do this every day, it'll probably clear up. And I say the serenity prayer 50 times a day. And I'll come back and see you in 2 weeks and see how the treatment went.
Yeah.
So they come back and I said, well, did you say it 50 times? So well, I tried it for 2 days and everything kind of cleared up. But I think that short and learning and memorizing short passages from scripture and stuff like that, and teaching kids to do that.
Yeah, you know, that replicates something that the Stoics actually found useful in dealing with anger, which is to have what they call dogmas at hand, you know, short passages about the nature of things. And they would, and we don't have any like discussion about how effective this was, but
they focus attention on their inability to overcome anything aside from the way they think about, which indicates the relationship of the estimative sense as the seat really of the irascible appetite, because you have to be evaluating your abilities.
Okay.
And if you know you have no hope of getting revenge, for example, then the anger is either going to subside or it's going to
gives way to sadness.
Despondency.
Yeah.
And then you might go into hatred again.
You know what though? I mean, people can have all sorts of. Thomas and Aristotle both talk in very reasonable ways about like people realizing that they won't be able to get revenge, so then they'll quit being angry. And you know, our experience shows us that people can have all sorts of crazy misestimations of their possibility of getting revenge. So my I don't know, writing something on YouTube about some celebrity, I'm getting revenge on them, you know. So long that's that phenomena aspect of it, you know. So long as I can somehow think that it's revenge, I can get suckered in by it. Yeah.
So when you do a lot of scripture scholarship, they talk about the biblical understanding of justice is right relationship. And I don't know if that's, but I would say that if we desire justice in anger, and we really are seeking punishment, what is the nature of that punishment? The true nature of the punishment. We tend to overdo it.
Yeah.
But is it somehow seeking right relationship with that person, and so in some way seeking their reform would satisfy our revenge, and so correcting someone is actually and saying, look, this hurt me, I would not like to do it again, I think it was wrong. But is that enough punishment, just saying that to somebody and hoping that has an effect of their reformation?
It depends on the somebody. I mean, some people you can't reach without, imposing pretty high penalties on them. But Thomas does talk about this.
But their reform, is that the object
It
of
can be.
anger?
No, I mean, it can't.
That's the desire.
It can be. What the desire is for imposing vindication. Now, that vindication could be for their reform.
Was that the true?
Well, the desire is for the equality of the relationship.
Okay.
The relationship has been unequalized because psychologically you've been diminished the spirit,
Yes.
Yeah.
the greatness of your soul in a way. This is dealing with St. Thomas' notion of virtual quantity.
I'm not comfortable with that. I don't think that the desire behind anger is for vindication.
That's what Thomas says, though.
Well,
I mean, at multiple places.
I go back to it because, in a sense, the desire for vindication would be exactly what's behind vengeance as a virtue.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, that's my point. Anger it requires a kind of interaction between several virtues to get the point of anger. But when I work on just meekness as a way to control anger, anger is rising from the injustice in a sense. I feel that there was an injustice. And this anger just, raises, and I need to keep controlling it. But the first way to control anger by meekness is not focusing on the rationale, because that's for justice, and vindication will be the right way to analyze if there is a point to this anger, if there is a vindication for it. And then I need to practice a different virtue, and maybe I need to be clement too.
Yes.
So, but if I mix up too much the two things, at that point I confuse temperance with justice, and temperance works at that part of my animal side that is not my rational focus on the kind of retribution I need to give to somebody else, which is for justice and is the will. So the will is not controlling my anger. Anger is controlled by temperance through meekness. That's why, and I agree, there are several passages in which all these things are put together, and the vices of vengeance and clemency coincide, which is interesting because they relate to justice and temperance. But in a sense, the virtue of justice wouldn't have cruelty and brutality and permissiveness, in a sense, as vices. Because justice is just what it is. You have to give 10,
strict justice,
So, but if I need to moderate something else, at that point I have different vices related to my temperance and to a different part of myself, which is not the rational soul. So, anyway, maybe I'm wrong. I think, there is kind of, there are nuanced meanings behind Aquinas' treatment, but unfortunately there are different parts, so you have to put them together and see how they interact.
Well, that's it. I think they are integrated. When a person is virtuous, and part of the challenge is to be able to integrate them, because we could pay attention to one and then not to the other.
So my point is that the moment in which I focus on the kind of retribution and I desire the right retribution, I'm already in the vengeance side.
Right, and that's where he talks about it. Right, that's where he talks about what Ron was asking about, which is the motive of vengeance.
If the money changes in the temple, would that be what Ron was?
Oh yeah, they had it coming. They had it coming. That's one of the paradigmatic instances that early Christian discussions about anger tend to focus on. There's that. There's these passages like in the Sermon on the Mount. Thomas does think that there are cases where we ought to get angry, where it's the right thing to do. Presumably, this God-man is going to be A-okay with his psychic makeup, however we want to put it.
The word of Gaelmai does occur in the New Testament with regard to Christ's anger.
It does. Isn't that with respect to the fig tree thing, I think?
The Pharisees ambushed him.
Oh, yeah.
He was very angry with him. Orge is the word. But you hardly ever see that addressed. They'll talk about the running them out of the temple. But they never say, well, Jesus was angry. People kind of bristle.
So that's another thing, too, that... Well, one sec. There is something that's worth bringing up. Aristotle talks about the possibility of having a virtuous disposition with respect to anger, where you don't actually feel the anger, but you act as reason would bid an angry person to act in those circumstances. The Stoics also treat that. So it could have been that Jesus was, just this is how a Stoic would interpret Jesus in that. He was saying, I'm not really angry, but I'm going to make the face and whip him and, that sort of business. Yeah.
It's about right relationship. We've been talking about a right relationship between myself and another.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the only thing. I mean, when I get mad at an inanimate object, I certainly don't think that he has malice towards me.
Well,
and I go back to what you said about the prisoners.
Yeah.
What you try to get them to say is any little slight thing against them, they take as malice.
Yeah.
They have too much of importance in themselves in both of those cases.
Sure.
And part of what you're trying to do is get a right relationship between yourself and the world.
Yeah.
And a self-understanding of that. In other words, you have to have a proper self-love. And the only way you get a proper self-love is you understood yourself in relationship to other things. Things are different than other people. You should get madder at your wife getting mad at you and
don't tell her that.
Justice or slighting you.
Yeah.
You should at somebody in a car, right? There's something wrong when that happens when you do that.
Yeah.
That if you got madder at that than your wife's slighting you, you're not understanding the relationship of something which is love. You have to have proper love of yourself, and you have to have proper love of those who are near you, and a proper love of those who are somewhat distant from you, and you have to have a proper love of God. All of those would be improper relationships that have something to do with you wanting something like justice, but you're not going to find justice. You're not going to get justice from the stone.
Oh, yeah.
And those prisoners are not going to get justice by thinking that everybody did that thing out of malice to them, right?
Yeah. I have to say, too, that I don't think that the prisoners were unusual for our culture.
No. They're just...
Yeah.
They got caught.
Yeah.
But the prisoners are in a prolonged outburst. That's the difference.
For this conference on faith, reason, and leadership, what deficit of anger do you think is most harmful?
Oh, you mean like which vicious disposition, or?
Where do we have a deficit of anger?
Oh, where don't we get angry enough?
That is impeding our faith life.
You go, we should get angry.
Yeah. Where do you believe?
Oh.
And where are we avoiding?
Where do we have a deficit of?
Where do we need to get angry?
Well, I mean, I think Cassian's right about this. Cassian thinks the only time we should get angry at ourselves, or get angry is at ourselves for our sins and stuff like that. I'm not going to say that he's right about that part, but we should actually get angry at ourselves when we screw up, Not in the sense that we begin to hate ourselves and act in irrational ways to ourselves, but we should get angry at the things that screw us up. Where else should we get angry? I mean, when we see mismanagement of relationships or offices or stuff like that, it's legitimate to get angry. But then it has to be acted on in the right way. I've run into so many people that would get angry about something that their parish priest is doing, and my first response is, "Did you talk to the bishop?" And then they're like, "No." And you realize they just like to get angry at stuff, even sometimes legitimate stuff. But anger can be a great catalyst for getting things done that need to get done. Yeah.
Most anger, psychologists are discovering that most anger is always going to be related towards an objective or a goal. A 2-year-old, calling across the floor, wants to go and shake the table, and you know that you knock the table over, and you stop the 2-year-old from doing it.
Yeah.
He or she gets angry.
Sure.
Because they stop from achieving their goal or objective. So in a sense, anger, if you really trace it back, some goal in life or objective is not being achieved.
Right. So that's part of what Thomas is talking about is the difficult good. There's opposition to it. But some of it is, sometimes we get angry because people are just jerks to us. And we weren't doing anything or intending anything. And they come along and they just act like, jerks to us for no reason. That's what hubris is, Yeah.
So the reason I asked that is 2 of my folks on my team are African American. One is a veteran who lost his leg in Iraq. And I try to understand the nature of racism and some of the rage that exists within African American communities beyond some of the political things. I was wondering if you have any insight on how that matters, because I'm trying to avoid blinders to it, but it just seems it's fueled by the leaders at times, and other times lack of virtue in general, but then you see legitimate cases of deep injustices and harm done to people.
Yeah, and we're always in situations where everything's piled up on top of everything else. It's not like we get to work on this virtue in isolation from everything else. We live in environments that are very messy. When you're asking about that, I'm reminded about Martin Luther King wrote a book towards the end of his life called Where Do We Go From Here? And this is after he became unpopular because the Black Power movement had sort of supplanted stuff. And he was saying, look, if this is all you've got to offer is counter-violence and rage, that's not gonna solve anything. Now, is that the answer for today? Probably not. I don't know. But the other thing that I'm reminded of too, and I was going to talk about here later, when you're trying to adjudicate who should be angry and who shouldn't be angry, you're placed in situations where it's always going to be messy, and you try to work out the best understanding of it as you can. Alistair McIntyre has this really interesting piece about moral dilemmas, where he says moral dilemmas genuinely exist, and they exist precisely as a sign of how screwed up things have gotten. There aren't moral dilemmas in the abstract. There's moral dilemmas when we are in cases where we do have to choose between X and Y, and neither one is optimal because we didn't choose Z back then. And I think this situation is like a, to the nth power example of that.
Third order effects.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that. I've worked on Indian reservations, and especially among the Plain Indians, and there's something called red rage, deep anger, deep injustice that goes way back. And culturally, the past isn't the past for them. Very much the present. We're the Western mind is really kind of get over it, but with the native culture, yesterday is today, very much so. And what you're really talking about identifying is something more than personal anger, but what you would identify as generational anger.
Yeah.
And it's something that is in you culturally, not just consciously, but a kind of subconscious cultural thing. And I don't have an answer for that. We do a lot of forgiveness prayers where we lead people into forgiveness meditations. After they've identified the rage, though, like with Father McVeigh, you have to identify it, live with it, kind of acknowledge it. You got to tell God you're mad, or tell someone. But also, what we do, and I did this at Paladar Canyon, where there was a tremendous massacre of Comanche Indians in Paladar Canyon, and I said a mass there in the Paladar Canyon for the healing between whites and Indians, to break the back of generational anger with that intention, because we're dealing with something more than sin. But I believe what Paul talks about is principalities, powers, and dominions when you're dealing with something like generational anger. You're dealing with a spiritual warfare. And the way that you come at that is through spiritual weapons like the Mass and prayers.
Father, I triggered a thought. I was in an airborne pathfinder unit as a young soldier. Our battle cry was Geronimo. And every jump out of the airplane, you would scream Geronimo. And I began to say, who is this Indian Geronimo? And I didn't realize the injustices committed against Geronimo. And I tried, it was a tortured history that he was kind of given, but he lost all his dignity at the end of life. He was a mighty warrior, a remarkable warrior, and yet, so you're right, the anger, that's a great way of saying it, this generational, what did you call it?
Generational anger.
Yeah,
so not a personal anger, but generational.
I think because the American Indians suffered greatly too, and they're the quiet, they're not getting they don't get a lot of attention. They just get their reservation and addiction.
It's still okay to be racist towards them. It's very much allowed in South Dakota.
We have that in the West, Ireland, generational anger. That goes back 800 years.
So, okay, so one last thing about this.
What about
Islam?
Oh.
Okay, now we have, any thoughts on the radicalization of Islam and the anger now in the Middle East? Because there's a book called What Went Wrong, where they talk about after the Ottoman Empire, Islam's decline continued unabated. Does this also play into something different?
I think, when we're asked, so there's a few things to say. I think once we start asking about these like really big generational civilization level things, we're beyond the level of analysis that Thomas would provide us with. Maybe we can stretch it, I don't know. But so we're in more, at least as far as this goes, uncharted territory. I'm not a specialist in Middle East politics or history or stuff like that, but I do follow some of the stuff. And I would say that, to begin with, within the Islamic world, we have a lot of heterogeneity of groups, So it's difficult to generalize about, Islam as such, because you have the Sunni Shiite division, and then, are you talking about, which Shiites are you talking about? And then there's all these other things that are layered on top of that, tribal affiliation, the nationalities that we imposed, on people and stuff like that. And then there's this history. You can say this, if we're talking about what people call radical Islam, there's a sort of long felt historical grievance involved with that, or whether we're going to call it Salafism or whatever. That you have this first reaction to the the Mongols coming in and raising hell all across the entirety of Iraq and destroying lots of drainage ditches and turning areas that were previously pretty verdant into deserts, and a theology beginning to emerge about that. God is angry with us because we've abandoned the proper ways. Then that gets used by Wahhabi in figuring out why Islam is lost out to the West, and then that gets taken up by 20th century figures like Khattab and brought into that. I will say this too, that when I'm looking at those phenomena and radical Islam, one of the areas that I work in, Ron doesn't know about this, is fascist studies. It's just sort of a sideline because I have an interest in that historical phenomenon. And you can look at, radical regimes like that. And then, there's this whole debate about whether we should talk about, Islamofascism or stuff like that. And I think, no, that's a different type of totalitarian approach that makes 20th century fascism and even 20th century, Marxist-Leninism look pretty pale in comparison, because it can draw upon this incredible historical reservoir of stuff going back to the time of Muhammad for its ideology. Now you punch in all sorts of rage primarily among young men at being treated, poorly by their governments, who often don't serve anybody's interests except for the powerful, not even ours. I mean, we sometimes install them and they don't do what we want them to do. And you've got an ideology that can just suck them in, and that's why things like ISIS can actually, you look at what's going on with that. They can find recruits, and the recruiting is coming in large part fueled by anger, I think. But again, still we're getting way beyond Thomas's analyses. I'm not sure how I'd apply those to that. That's sort of my 2 cents take. But I'm not a specialist in these sort of things.
We talk about marriage therapists. They'll say, well, I got a couple that come in.
Yeah.
And they're really angry at one another. I got a pretty good shot at putting this marriage together. Unless they're still passionate. But if they come in, I say, nobody answers. They just sit there. There's no anger anymore.
Yeah.
I
married tell them stop wasting your money on marriage therapy. Yeah. It's over with by the time they have them in.
Well, that's interesting.
They are now neutral toward one another.
Or they hate each other.
Yeah. Hate's a passion. There's nothing there. There's a difference. And I don't know.
Okay.
Anymore, so that's all gone. So,
yeah.
when I was in Europe, and I was talking about in Europe 10 years ago, I said, how do you feel about the church? There's no anger, nothing.
Just a total indifference.
They talk to young people. There's still, I don't know why it is, but whether it's a justified anger, they're angry at the church for some reason. That's a very end thing, to be angry at the church.
Yeah.
Whatever they do with my formation, okay? When do we get to the next level when that anger turns into indifference? Then we have an evangelical presence.
That's interesting, yeah. And again, that also could apply to organizations. When people are like checked out, that's probably a bad sign. So.
When people are frustrated with the government, they check out or something.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
The spirit. If you guys, for leadership, when I'm also marriage counseling, I use John Gottman, Dr. John Gottman.
Yeah.
Love Lab. Really good. Basically, he teaches people how to complain well, and say, look, what you're doing is doing this to me, I need you to stop it. And overcoming avoidance, he's really good.
And contempt.
Yeah, and contempt, and he has the 4 horsemen of marriages. But that's something you can implement, not just in marriages, but also in leadership contexts and teams, where you just set up the rules. Look, you're allowed to complain, and this is how you do it. You don't call someone a jerk, but you say, hey, please stop doing this, it's hurting me, this is how what you're doing is affecting me.
Yeah.
And you can do that in a volatile fashion. He allows that. You can be volatile, fired up. But as long as you actually complain and don't say, how'd your mother raise you? You can't say that. That's against the rules.
What'd you say, overcoming what?
Overcoming, I don't remember. Overcoming, complaining overcomes, complaining is the key antidote to overcoming criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and defensiveness. If you do that, then you break the back of that. So it's a form of punishment, really.
Well, yeah, when people get to complain and they're actually listened to, and the other person says, "I'm sorry," some vindication has taken place.
It's justice. You've won over the person, and you've corrected the situation. And so I think that in some way, anger then is perfected by compassion. I mean, because once you seek to have right relationship with the person, that breaks forth into compassion for the person, seeking the conversion of the person, seeking the good of the person. I mean, not that you're the one that convert them or something.
Yeah.
But in the sense of you want to have a right relationship with them. I'm not going to have it until I tell them what they did to me. I got to tell them. And that's it. I'm not going to punish them. I'm just going to tell them. And we live in an avoidant culture, and people don't like that. So it's enough punishment on its own.
Yeah. Well, do we have the other speaker? Or?
No, Joe Jordan didn't show up for some reason.
So,
Ron Pelaez is on his way, coming up from Washington, D.C. So
okay.
He'll get here
Thank you, Greg.
Well, you guys have given me a lot of good stuff to think about too, so that's useful for me.